Are you Ghost Rider?
The man in seat 14A looked ordinary, tired eyes, worn jacket, just another single dad heading home. But when the Boeing 737's engine exploded at 37,000 feet and he whispered 4 words into the radio, 2 F-22 pilots froze mid-flight. Ghost Rider was supposed to be dead for 10 years. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning light filtered through the terminal windows at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, casting long shadows across rows of blue plastic seats. Brandon Cole sat alone near gate 47, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching travelers hurry past with their rolling suitcases and worried faces. He looked like everyone else. Maybe a bit more tired. Maybe a bit more weathered. Just another middle-aged man in jeans and an old flight jacket, waiting for a plane to take him somewhere that mattered. But Brandon Cole was not like everyone else. On his wrist, beneath the frayed sleeve of his jacket, sat a watch that told a different story. It was a pilot's chronograph, scratched, dented, the crystal spiderwebbed with cracks. Most people would have thrown it away years ago. But Brandon kept it because it reminded him of who he used to be, before everything fell apart. Before he died. Well, before everyone thought he died. That was 10 years ago now. A lifetime. He'd been a different person then, younger, sharper, certain of his place in the world. Major Brandon Cole, United States Air Force. Call sign, Ghost Rider. One of the best combat pilots in the service, the kind of flyer other pilots whispered about in ready rooms and training facilities. He'd flown missions that didn't officially exist, in places the government would never acknowledge. He'd landed damaged aircraft in conditions that should have been impossible. He'd saved lives and taken them, always in service of something larger than himself. And then, one night over hostile territory, his plane went down. The mission was classified. The crash site was in enemy hands. The extraction window was measured in minutes. By the time rescue teams could reach the area, there was nothing left but burning wreckage and scattered debris. The Air Force declared him killed in action. They held a memorial service with an empty casket. They carved his name into a marble wall at the academy. They gave his medals to his sister because his wife had left him 2 years earlier, unable to handle the deployments and the secrets and the nights he came home with eyes that had seen too much. But Brandon hadn't died in that crash. He'd crawled from the wreckage with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and burns across his back. He'd walked 17 miles through desert terrain to reach a village where no one asked questions. From there, he'd made his way to a port city, then onto a cargo ship, then to a place where Major Brandon Cole could cease to exist. He should have contacted his command. Should have called for extraction. Should have come home to the honors and the debriefing and the inevitable return to the cockpit. But something inside him had broken that night. Not his body, that would heal. Something deeper. The part of him that could keep climbing back into a fighter jet knowing that each mission might be his last. The part that could make peace with the violence and the secrets and the weight of all those classified operations that slowly crushed his soul. So he'd let them think he was dead. For a year, he'd drifted through Southeast Asia, doing odd jobs, keeping his head down. He'd grown a beard. Let his hair get shaggy. Stopped moving like a soldier. Eventually, he made his way back to the States using documentation that wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny but was good enough for a man who just wanted to disappear. He'd gotten his commercial pilot's license under a slightly different name, close enough to his real one that he could answer to it naturally, different enough that background checks came up clean. Brandon Cole became Brandon Coleman on paper, and no one looked twice. For 9 years, he'd flown regional routes. Small planes, quiet flights, passengers who never knew the man at the controls had once been a ghost in the deadliest skies on Earth. He'd kept his distance from his old life. From the Air Force. From anyone who might recognize him. Most of all, from his son. Ben had been 4 years old when Brandon died. His sister Sarah had taken the boy in, raised him in Los Angeles while Brandon sent money through untraceable channels and watched from afar as his son grew up without a father. The guilt was a constant weight, heavier than any medal they'd ever given him. But last month, something had changed. Ben had turned 14, and Sarah had sent Brandon a message through their careful, anonymous system: "He's asking questions. He deserves to know you're alive." So Brandon had bought a ticket on Flight 227, Dallas to Los Angeles. He'd planned what he would say, how he would explain. He'd rehearsed the conversation 1,000 times in his mind. He just wanted to see his son. To try to be a father, even if it was 10 years too late. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom: "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now boarding Flight 227 with service to Los Angeles." Brandon stood, shouldered his small duffel bag, and joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the jet bridge. He found his seat, 14A, window, and settled in, pressing his forehead against the cool plastic as the cabin filled around him. A businessman squeezed past him into 14B, already on his phone, barking instructions to someone about quarterly reports. Brandon tuned him out, watching the ground crew load luggage into the cargo hold below. The plane was a Boeing 737-800. Reliable workhorse of the skies. He'd flown in hundreds of them over the past 9 years. Safe. Predictable. Boring, in the best possible way. He didn't know it yet, but in less than an hour, this ordinary plane would demand every bit of skill he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. The engines hummed to life beneath him. That familiar vibration traveled up through the floor, through his seat, into his bones. Brandon closed his eyes and took a slow breath. Just another flight. Just another morning. Just another step toward the son he'd abandoned. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway, and lifted into the brilliant Texas sky. And somewhere in the back of Brandon's mind, in a place he'd locked away long ago, something stirred. An old instinct. A pilot's awareness that never quite sleeps. Something wasn't right. He couldn't say what it was yet. Just a feeling. A tiny discordant note in the symphony of sounds and sensations that filled a commercial aircraft in flight. But Brandon had learned long ago to trust his instincts. They'd kept him alive when everything else said he should be dead. 3 rows behind Brandon, General Diana Brooks settled into her seat with the efficient movements of someone who'd spent 30 years in uniform. She was in civilian clothes today, dark slacks, a pressed blouse, but she carried herself like a soldier even when she wasn't wearing stars on her collar. Her 2 aides, both young Air Force officers, flanked her in seats 17B and 17C. They were quiet, respectful, already pulling out tablets to review briefing documents for the meetings in Los Angeles. Diana didn't pull out her tablet yet. She was tired. 3 days of back-to-back sessions at the Pentagon, arguing about budgets and procurement and the 100 small battles that came with being one of the highest-ranking women in the United States Air Force. She'd earned her 4th star through skill, determination, and 3 combat deployments that had tested every ounce of her courage. She'd commanded fighter wings, led tactical operations, and made decisions that saved lives and ended them. But right now, she just wanted to close her eyes and rest. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Around her, passengers settled into the familiar routine of a morning flight: books and laptops, headphones and small talk. Diana's gaze drifted forward, scanning the cabin out of habit. Always know your surroundings. Always identify the exits. Old training that never quite faded. Her eyes landed on the man in 14A. She could only see the back of his head and one shoulder, but something about him caught her attention. The way he sat, very still, very upright. The old flight jacket, worn smooth at the elbows. The posture of someone who'd spent time in cockpits. A pilot, maybe. Or former military. There was something in the way he carried himself. Diana found herself staring at him, trying to place why he seemed familiar. She'd met thousands of people over her career. Countless pilots, soldiers, support staff. Most of their faces blurred together over time. But every once in a while, she'd see someone who triggered a memory, like a key turning in a long-locked door. She thought back to Syria, 12 years ago. She'd been a colonel then, leading a convoy through disputed territory. They'd been ambushed, a coordinated attack with RPGs and small arms fire. Her vehicle had taken a direct hit. She remembered the fire. The smoke so thick she couldn't breathe. The crushing certainty that she was going to die there, trapped in a burning Humvee in a country that didn't want her. And then someone had pulled her out. A pilot. His face covered in soot and dust, his voice impossibly calm despite the chaos raging around them. "Hang on, ma'am. I'll get you out." He dragged her clear of the wreckage, then gone back for her gunner, then back again for the driver. By the time the smoke cleared and reinforcements arrived, the pilot had disappeared, back to his aircraft, back to his mission. She'd wanted to thank him, to commend him for his actions. But when she asked around, all anyone could tell her was his call sign, Ghost Rider. She tried to track him down after that deployment, but by then he was gone. Killed in action on a classified mission. No body recovered. Just a name on a memorial wall. Diana had attended the ceremony. She'd saluted the empty casket. She'd written a letter to his family, though she'd never received a response. Ghost Rider. The pilot who'd saved her life and then vanished like smoke. She shook her head, pushing the memory away. That was a long time ago. The man in 14A was just another passenger. The resemblance, if there was one, was just her tired mind playing tricks. She pulled out her tablet and tried to focus on her briefing documents. But her gaze kept drifting back to seat 14A. Brandon felt it before anyone else did. A vibration. Subtle. Wrong. Most people wouldn't notice. It was buried beneath the normal sounds of flight, the hum of engines, the rush of air over the wings, the faint rattle of the cabin that passengers learned to ignore. But Brandon wasn't most people. He'd spent 20 years learning to read aircraft the way other people read books. Every sound told a story. Every vibration carried information. And right now, the left engine was telling him something he didn't want to hear. He straightened in his seat, tilting his head slightly, listening. There. A tiny skip in the rhythm. Like a heartbeat stuttering for just a fraction of a second. It smoothed out. Probably nothing. Probably just a patch of turbulence or a brief fluctuation in fuel flow. Brandon forced himself to relax. He was being paranoid. This wasn't a combat zone. This wasn't a damaged fighter jet limping home. This was a commercial flight on a clear morning with professional pilots at the controls. Everything was fine. The businessman next to him was still on his phone, oblivious. Across the aisle, a young mother was reading to her daughter from a picture book. Behind him, he could hear the quiet murmur of conversation, the rustle of magazines, the ordinary sounds of people getting comfortable for a 2-hour flight. Everything was fine. Brandon closed his eyes and tried to think about what he would say to Ben. How do you explain to a 14-year-old boy that his father had been alive all this time? That he'd chosen to stay away, to let his son believe he was dead? There was no good explanation. No words that would make it right. But he had to try. The plane shuddered. Brandon's eyes snapped open. That wasn't turbulence. The businessman next to him looked up from his phone, frowning. Did you feel that? Before Brandon could answer, the plane shuddered again, harder this time. A metallic groan echoed through the fuselage, the sound of something under stress, something being pushed beyond its design limits. Brandon's hand went to his armrest, gripping it tightly. His other hand went to his watch, an unconscious gesture, checking the time out of habit even though time didn't matter right now. What mattered was the left engine, which was no longer making the steady hum it should be making. What mattered was the slight list to the left, the way the plane was beginning to yaw off its heading. What mattered was the faint smell of smoke, acrid, chemical, wrong, beginning to seep into the cabin air. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain." The voice over the intercom was trying to sound calm, but Brandon could hear the tension underneath. "We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare for possible turbulence." Minor technical difficulties. Brandon's jaw tightened. That was pilot speak for, "Something's very wrong, but I don't want to panic anyone." The plane lurched suddenly, tilting sharply to the left. Passengers gasped. Someone screamed. And then Brandon heard it, the sound that every pilot dreads, the sound that means a situation has just gone from bad to catastrophic. A loud, grinding boom from the left side of the aircraft. The plane shook violently. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, dangling like pale ghosts. The cabin erupted in screams. Brandon was already moving. "Sir. Sir, you need to stay in your seat." The flight attendant was young, maybe 25, her face pale with fear as she tried to block the aisle. Brandon could see her hands shaking, see the terror in her eyes even as she tried to do her job. "The pilots are incapacitated or dead," Brandon said, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute certainty. "If I don't get to that cockpit in the next 60 seconds, everyone on this plane is going to die." "You don't know. I just heard the left engine fail catastrophically. We've lost hydraulics, probably lost the number 1 electrical bus, and we're descending at about 1,500 feet per minute. In 2 minutes, we'll be in an uncontrolled spiral. In 4 minutes, we'll hit the ground. Now open that door." The flight attendant stared at him, mouth open. Brandon didn't wait. He pushed past her, moving up the aisle with the sure-footed balance of someone who'd walked through worse conditions. The plane was tilting at a severe angle now, making each step a challenge. Passengers clutched their armrests, crying, praying, frozen in fear. He reached the cockpit door. It was locked, standard procedure since 9/11. "Open it," he said to the flight attendant who'd followed him. She fumbled with her keys, hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the lock. The plane lurched again. Someone's carry-on bag broke free from an overhead bin, tumbling down the aisle. The lock clicked open. Brandon pushed through the door. The scene inside the cockpit confirmed his worst fears. The captain was slumped forward against his harness, blood running down the side of his face from a gash on his forehead. The first officer was conscious but in shock, clutching his arm, his face white as paper. And the instrument panel looked like something from a nightmare, warning lights blazing in red and amber, alarms screaming, screens flickering. Brandon didn't hesitate. He grabbed the captain's shoulder, checking for a pulse. Still alive. Unconscious, but alive. "Who are you?" the first officer gasped, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. Brandon slid into the captain's seat, his hands already moving across the controls with the muscle memory of 20 years of flying. He silenced the alarms one by one, reading the situation faster than thought. Left engine, catastrophic failure, completely offline. Hydraulic system A, offline. Hydraulic system B, pressure dropping rapidly. Flight control system, degraded. No rudder authority. Minimal elevator control. Ailerons barely responding. They were at 31,000 feet, descending at 1,800 feet per minute, the plane yawing to the left in a slow spiral that would become unrecoverable in minutes. This should be impossible to fly. Should be. Brandon's hands moved to the throttle controls. He pushed the right engine to climb power, pulled the left throttle to idle. The asymmetric thrust would be massive, but it was the only way to control the yaw without a rudder. The plane shuddered and groaned but began to level slightly. "What are you doing?" the first officer whispered. "That's not, you can't fly like that." "Watch me," Brandon said. He made micro-adjustments to the throttle, compensating for every shift in the plane's attitude. It was like trying to balance on a tightrope while juggling, except the tightrope was made of ice and the slightest mistake would kill 132 people. But Brandon had done this before. Not in a 737. Not with passengers. But he'd flown damaged aircraft through hostile skies when every gauge was screaming failure and every instinct said to eject. He'd learned to listen to the plane itself, to feel what it needed through his hands and his body and some sixth sense that came from thousands of hours in the cockpit. The plane steadied. The descent rate slowed. Brandon reached for the radio. His hand hovered over the transmit button. This was the moment. Once he made this call, everything would change. His carefully constructed anonymity would shatter. Questions would be asked. People would want to know how a dead man was flying a crippled airliner. But 132 people were depending on him. He pressed the button. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 227, we have experienced catastrophic engine failure and loss of flight controls. Request immediate emergency assistance. Static crackled, then a voice, Flight 227, this is Los Angeles Center. We copy your mayday. What is the nature of your emergency and who is the pilot in command? Brandon took a breath. Then he said the name he'd sworn he'd never say again. This is Ghost Rider. I am declaring an in-flight emergency and requesting priority handling to the nearest suitable airport with emergency equipment standing by. Silence on the radio. Then, quietly, say again, Flight 227. Did you identify yourself as Ghost Rider? Affirmative, Los Angeles Center. Ghost Rider is in command of this aircraft. I have a crippled bird with 132 souls on board. I need those emergency services and I need them now. Another pause. Brandon could imagine the chaos his words were causing in the control center. Ghost Rider was supposed to be dead. The call sign had been retired. It shouldn't exist. But it did. And he did. Copy, Ghost Rider, the controller said, and Brandon could hear the awe and disbelief in his voice. We are declaring an emergency. Stand by for routing. In the tower, alarms were going off. Supervisors were rushing to screens. Someone was already making calls to Edwards Air Force Base, where two F-22 Raptors were finishing a training mission. And in those Raptors, two young pilots were about to hear a name that would change everything they thought they knew about the man flying that crippled plane. Lieutenant Tyler Blaze Donovan was pulling his F-22 into a lazy victory roll when his radio crackled to life. Blaze, this is Edwards Tower. Abort your training and proceed immediately to Vector 270. You are being diverted for emergency escort. Blaze straightened his aircraft, all business now. Copy, Tower. What's the situation? We have a civilian airliner in distress. Boeing 737, Flight 227 out of Dallas. Left engine failure, flight control issues, 132 souls on board. Understood. We're on our way. What's the pilot's status? There was a pause. Then, Blaze, the pilot has identified himself as Ghost Rider. Blaze's hands froze on the controls. Say again, Tower. The pilot is using the call sign Ghost Rider. Authentication checks are, well, they're coming back positive. It's him. That's impossible, Blaze whispered. Ghost Rider is dead. Apparently not. He's flying a crippled 737 with nothing but engine thrust right now, and he needs your eyes on his aircraft. Can you assist? Blaze felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Ghost Rider. The legend. The ghost. The pilot whose techniques were still taught at every flight school in the Air Force, whose missions were still studied in classified briefings, whose name was carved on a memorial wall at the academy. Ghost Rider was dead. Had been for 10 years. Except he wasn't. He was in the air right now, fighting to save a plane full of people. Blaze. Do you copy? Copy, Tower, Blaze said, his voice rough. We're inbound. Give me coordinates. His wingman, Lieutenant Carter, Fangs, Miller, pulled up alongside him. Blaze, did I just hear what I think I heard? Yeah. How is that possible? I have no idea. But we're about to find out. They punched their throttles, and the two Raptors surged forward, streaking across the sky at supersonic speed. Inside his cockpit, Blaze's mind raced. He'd grown up hearing stories about Ghost Rider. Every fighter pilot had. The man who could fly anything in any conditions. The pilot who'd brought a burning F-16 home through a sandstorm with no instruments. The ghost who disappeared on a black op and never came back. They said he was the best there ever was. They said his techniques were impossible to teach because they required instinct more than training. They said he was dead. But the authentication checks didn't lie. Somehow, impossibly, Ghost Rider was alive. And he was flying a plane that shouldn't be able to fly. Contact in 2 minutes, Fangs said over the radio. Blaze stared ahead at the empty sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the clouds, a legend was fighting for his life. And for the lives of everyone on that plane. Brandon's world had narrowed to the controls in front of him and the feel of the aircraft beneath his hands. The 737 wasn't designed to be flown like this. Modern commercial jets were built with multiple redundancies. If one system failed, another would take over. But when you lost engine power and hydraulics simultaneously, those redundancies meant nothing. He was flying on raw instinct now, using differential thrust to steer. Push power on the right engine, the nose would swing left. Pull it back, it would swing right. It was crude, imprecise, and required absolute concentration. One wrong move, 1 second of distraction, and the plane would enter a spin they'd never recover from. How long have you been flying? The first officer asked, his voice shaky. Long enough, Brandon said, not taking his eyes off the artificial horizon. I've never seen anyone fly like this. Where did you learn? Not now. The radio crackled. Ghost Rider, this is Edwards Tower. We have 2 F-22s inbound to your position for visual assessment. ETA 90 seconds. Copy, Edwards. Tell them to watch for debris. I think I lost part of the engine cowling. Acknowledged. Ghost Rider, what is your fuel status? Brandon glanced at the gauge. We've got enough to reach you. Barely. But I need that runway cleared and every piece of emergency equipment you have standing by. Understood. Runway 21 is being cleared now. Emergency services are mobilizing. One more thing, Brandon said. I'm going to need a long runway. My landing is going to be fast and ugly. Copy that. Runway 21 is 10,000 feet. Will that be sufficient? It'll have to be. Through the windscreen, Brandon saw them, 2 sleek silver shapes diving down from above, pulling into formation on either side of his crippled 737. F-22 Raptors. The most advanced fighter jets in the world. And in those cockpits, pilots who'd grown up hearing stories about him. Ghost Rider, this is Blaze. We have you visual. Assessing damage now. Blaze's Raptor slid closer, and Brandon could see the pilot's helmet turn as he examined the wounded airliner. Ghost Rider, you've got major damage to the left engine. It looks like you lost the entire fan assembly. There's hydraulic fluid streaming from the left wing, and I'm seeing structural damage to the rear stabilizer. Copy that, Blaze. Tell me something I don't know. Sir. Blaze's voice carried a note of awe. You're flying this thing on thrust alone. That's impossible. Tell that to the plane, Brandon said. She doesn't know she's supposed to be falling. A pause. Then, sir, how are you doing this? Brandon allowed himself a small, grim smile. Very carefully. Inside the cabin, passengers had moved beyond panic into a strange, hushed fear. Some prayed. Some held hands with strangers. Some just stared out the windows at the fighter jets flanking them, understanding without being told that this situation was far worse than anyone had said. In row 17, Diana Brooke sat perfectly still, her military training the only thing keeping her together. She'd heard the captain's voice over the intercom. She'd heard the name he'd used. Ghost Rider. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But she knew that voice. She'd heard it before, in another life, in another crisis. Hang on, ma'am. I'll get you out. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, ignoring the protests of her aides. She made her way forward, gripping seats for balance as the plane tilted and swayed. She reached the cockpit door. It was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. And there, in the captain's seat, was the man from 14A. The man she'd thought looked familiar. His hands moved across the controls with absolute precision. His face was calm, focused, like he was born to sit in that seat. "Brandon," she whispered. He didn't turn, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "Not now, Diana," he said quietly. "Let me save these people first. Then you can yell at me all you want." Diana's legs nearly gave out. It was him. After 12 years, after believing he was dead, after visiting his memorial and saluting his empty casket, he was alive. And he was saving their lives. She stepped back, giving him space to work. But she didn't leave. She couldn't. She had to see this through. "Ghost Rider, you are 15 miles from Edwards. Begin your descent at your discretion." Brandon checked his altitude. They were at 18,000 feet now, still too high, still descending too fast. "Beginning descent," he said. He eased back on the right engine's throttle, letting gravity take over. The plane's nose dropped, and the descent rate increased. 2,000 feet per minute. 2,500, 3,000. The first officer made a strangled sound. "That's too fast. We'll overshoot." "No, we won't," Brandon said calmly. He was calculating angles and vectors in his head, running numbers faster than any computer. He knew exactly how much altitude he needed to lose, how much runway he had to work with, how much speed he could carry. It would be close. Dangerously close. But it would work. Altitude 10,000 feet. Through the windscreen, he could see the desert now. Brown and tan and ochre, stretching to the horizon. And there, in the distance, a thin gray line, the runway at Edwards. "Blaze, Fangs, I need you to peel off," Brandon said. "I can't have you in my flight path when I come in." "Copy, Ghost Rider," Blaze said. "We'll stay high." "Sir, good luck." "Thanks, kid. See you on the ground." The two Raptors pulled up and away, climbing into a holding pattern overhead. Altitude 5,000 feet. Brandon's hands were steady on the controls, but his heart was pounding. This was it. The moment where training and instinct either worked or failed. Where he either saved 132 lives or they all died together. Altitude 3,000 feet. The runway was clearly visible now. He could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the sides, fire trucks, ambulances, crash teams. They thought he was going to crash. Maybe they were right. Altitude 2,000 feet. "Ghost Rider, you're coming in hot," the tower warned. "Your airspeed is." "I know," Brandon cut him off. "Trust me." Altitude 1,000 feet. The ground rushed up to meet them. Brandon could see individual vehicles now, people standing outside them, watching. Altitude 500 feet. His right hand pushed the throttle forward slightly, lifting the nose just a fraction. The plane responded, sluggish but obedient. Altitude 200 feet. Almost there. Altitude 100 feet. Now. Brandon pulled back on the throttle and felt the plane drop the last few feet. The main gear hit the runway with a jarring thud that rattled every bone in his body. One tire exploded immediately. The plane yawned hard to the left. Brandon fought it with throttle, pushing the right engine, forcing the nose back to center. They were going too fast. Way too fast. The runway markers were blurring past. He deployed what was left of the speed brakes. The plane shuddered and groaned. Still too fast. The end of the runway was approaching. Beyond it, rough desert terrain. Brandon made a decision. He cranked the throttle on the right engine to full power for just a second, forcing the plane into a controlled ground spin. The 737 pirouetted on the runway, tires screaming, metal screeching. And then, finally, it stopped. 200 feet from the end of the runway. For a long moment, nothing moved. Smoke rose from the landing gear. Alarms wailed inside the cockpit. Then, from the cabin, someone started clapping. Within seconds, the entire plane erupted in cheers, tears, and applause. Brandon let his hands fall from the controls. They were shaking. Behind him, Diana Brooks stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome back," she said softly. Brandon closed his eyes and let out a breath he'd been holding for 10 years. It's good to be back. The next few hours passed in a blur. Emergency crews swarmed the plane. Medics checked every passenger. News helicopters circled overhead. Within 20 minutes, every major network had broken into regular programming with the story, "Legendary Dead Pilot Saves 132 Lives." Brandon sat in a small office at the base, Diana across from him, two men in suits standing by the door. Military intelligence, probably. Or Pentagon liaisons. It didn't really matter. "You owe me an explanation," Diana said, her voice hard. "You owe everyone an explanation." Brandon nodded slowly. "I know. You were declared dead. We had a memorial service. Your name is on a wall. I know. And you just, what? Decided to disappear? To let everyone believe you were gone?" "Yes." Diana slammed her hand on the table. "Why?" Brandon was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Because I was broken, Diana. That last mission, the crash, I survived it, but something inside me didn't. I couldn't keep doing it. The missions, the lies, the killing. It was eating me alive." "So you ran?" "Yes." "You had a son." Brandon flinched. "I know. He grew up thinking his father was dead." "I know." Brandon's voice cracked slightly. "I know I failed him. I failed everyone. But I couldn't be that person anymore. The man you knew, Ghost Rider, he died in that crash. I just kept breathing." Diana stared at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You saved 132 people today, Brandon. You did something that should have been impossible. That's not a dead man. That's someone who never stopped being a hero, even when he tried to." "I'm not a hero. Tell that to the families who are going to hug their loved ones tonight because you didn't give up when that engine failed." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Mr. Cole, we're going to need a full debriefing. And there will be questions from the Pentagon. Your status, your resurrection, is going to create complications." "I understand. There's also the matter of your son," the man continued. "He's going to find out you're alive. Probably already has, given the news coverage. You should consider how you want to handle that." Brandon's chest tightened. "Can I see him? Before all the official stuff?" Diana stood. "I'll make it happen. Give me an hour." She walked out, already on her phone, making calls, pulling strings with the authority of a 4-star general. Brandon sat alone in the room, staring at his hands. They'd stopped shaking, but he could still feel the controls, still feel the plane fighting him, still feel that moment when they touched down and everything had somehow worked out. He'd saved them. All of them. But he'd also destroyed the quiet life he'd built. The anonymity. The peace. And now he had to face the son he'd abandoned. The house was small, tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Burbank. Diana's car pulled up to the curb, and Brandon sat in the passenger seat, unable to move. "He knows you're coming," Diana said gently. Sarah told him. "She's inside with him now." "What did she tell him?" "The truth. That you didn't die. That you've been alive this whole time." Brandon closed his eyes. "He must hate me. Only one way to find out." Brandon opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The afternoon sun was warm on his face. Somewhere down the street, kids were playing. A dog barked. Normal life, continuing as it always did. He walked up the path to the front door. Before he could knock, it opened. Sarah stood there, 10 years older than he remembered. Her hair was graying at the temples. She'd raised his son while he hid from the world. "Hi," Brandon said lamely. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Then she stepped forward and slapped him across the face. "That's for breaking his heart," she said. Then she hugged him fiercely. "And that's for being alive." Brandon held her, not trusting himself to speak. "He's in his room," Sarah said, pulling back. "Second door on the left." He's confused, Brandon. Angry. But he wanted to see you." Brandon nodded and walked inside. The house smelled like home, coffee and laundry detergent and something baking in the oven. Pictures lined the hallway. He stopped at one showing Ben at maybe 10 years old, holding a baseball bat, grinning at the camera. Brandon had missed that. He'd missed all of it. He reached the second door and knocked softly. "Come in," said a voice he barely recognized. Brandon opened the door. Ben sat on his bed, a teenager now, tall and lanky with Brandon's eyes and his mother's hair. He was wearing a baseball jersey and jeans, his hands clasped in his lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Hi," Brandon finally managed. "Hi," Ben said. Another silence. "I saw you on the news," Ben said. "They're calling you a hero." "I'm not. You saved a plane full of people." "I did my job." "Your job." Ben's voice had an edge to it now. "Which job? The one where you were a pilot? Or the one where you let me think you were dead for 10 years? Brandon took a step into the room. "Ben, I don't." Ben stood up, his jaw tight. "Don't try to explain. There's no explanation that makes this okay." "You're right." Ben blinked, surprised. "What?" "You're right. There's no explanation. Nothing I say is going to change the fact that I left you. That I let you grow up without a father. That I missed your birthdays and your baseball games and everything that mattered." "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm trying to stop being a coward," Brandon said quietly. "I ran away because I was broken and scared. I thought I was protecting you by staying gone. But I was wrong. I was just protecting myself." Ben's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "You were my hero. When I was little, before you died, you were everything to me. And then you were gone, and Aunt Sarah told me you died serving your country, and I was supposed to be proud. But mostly I was just sad. I'm sorry. And now you show up on TV, saving people, being brave, and everyone's talking about how amazing you are. But where were you when I needed you?" Brandon's throat was tight. "I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I was lost, Ben. And by the time I found my way back, so much time had passed that I didn't know how to come home." Ben wiped his eyes roughly. "Are you going to leave again?" No. How do I know that? You don't, Brandon said honestly. I can't give you proof. I can only give you my word. And I know that's not worth much right now. But I'm here, and I want to try. If you'll let me. Ben stared at him for a long time. Then, quietly, I don't even know you. I know. But maybe we could start over. Maybe I could try to be the father I should have been. It's too late for that. Maybe. But maybe it's not too late for me to just be here. To show up. To try. Ben looked down at his hands. I have a baseball game on Saturday. Brandon's heart jumped. Yeah. Yeah. If you wanted to come. I'd like that. It starts at 3. I'll be there. Ben nodded slowly. Then he looked up, and for the first time, Brandon saw a hint of something besides anger in his son's eyes. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of possibility. Okay, Ben said. Okay, Brandon echoed. They stood in awkward silence for another moment. Then Ben said, Aunt Sarah made cookies. They're in the kitchen if you want some. It was a small thing. An ordinary thing. But to Brandon, it felt like a door opening. I'd love some, he said. The Pentagon conference room was cold and sterile, all white walls and fluorescent lights. Brandon sat at one end of a long table, flanked by Diana on one side and a military lawyer on the other. Across from him sat 4 generals, 2 admirals, and a woman from the office of the Secretary of Defense. They'd been questioning him for 3 hours. Let me make sure I understand, said General Marcus Webb, a granite-faced man with 30 years of service. You faked your death, deserted your post, and spent 10 years in hiding. And now you expect us to just, what? Welcome you back. No, sir, Brandon said. I don't expect anything. I know what I did was wrong. Wrong? Webb's voice rose. Wrong doesn't begin to cover it. You abandoned your duty. You let your brothers and sisters in arms believe you were dead. You wasted resources on search and recovery operations. You caused immeasurable pain to your family and your unit. Yes, sir. And yet yesterday, you did something that our analysts say was impossible. You flew a crippled civilian aircraft with no hydraulics and no flight controls. You saved 132 lives using techniques that most pilots don't even believe can work. Brandon said nothing. So I have to ask, Webb continued, leaning forward. Who are you, really? Are you the deserter? Or are you the hero? I'm both, sir. And neither. One of the admirals spoke up. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have, Brandon said. I made terrible choices. I hurt people. But when that plane needed me, I did what I was trained to do. I saved people. Both things are true. Diana cleared her throat. If I may, sirs. Major Cole's actions yesterday prevented what would have been one of the worst aviation disasters in recent history. His skill and courage saved American lives. Doesn't that count for something? It counts for a great deal, Webb said. Which is why we're having this conversation instead of having him arrested. But it doesn't erase what he did. No one's asking you to erase it, Diana said. We're asking you to consider context. Major Cole was suffering from severe PTSD after years of combat operations. He made a desperate choice in a moment of crisis. And yesterday, he proved that despite everything, he's still the pilot we trained him to be. The woman from the Secretary of Defense's office had been quiet until now. She was younger than the generals, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Here's what's going to happen, she said, and the room fell silent. Major Cole, you will receive a general discharge under honorable conditions. Not a dishonorable discharge, given yesterday's actions, but not a full honorable discharge either, given the circumstances of your disappearance. Brandon nodded. Fair enough. You will be required to undergo a full psychological evaluation. And you will cooperate with a debriefing team who will document everything you know about the operations you conducted while in service. Understood. In exchange, she continued, we will not pursue criminal charges. Your benefits will be partially restored. And your name will be quietly removed from the memorial wall. Webb started to object, but she held up a hand. However, she said, there's one more condition. What's that? Brandon asked. The FAA wants to understand what you did yesterday. How you flew that plane. Your techniques could save lives in future emergencies. We want you to work with a team of investigators and trainers to document your methods. Brandon hesitated. I'm not sure I can teach what I did. A lot of it was instinct. Try, she said. Because if you can help even one other pilot save even one other plane, that's worth more than any discharge papers. Diana squeezed Brandon's arm under the table. All right, Brandon said. I'll try. Good. The woman stood. This meeting is concluded. Major Cole, you're free to go. We'll be in touch about the debriefing schedule. The generals and admirals filed out, leaving Brandon and Diana alone in the room. That went better than I expected, Diana said. Brandon laughed roughly. That was better. You're not in prison. I'd call that a win. Brandon shook his head. I don't deserve this. Any of this. Maybe not. But 132 people deserve to live, and you made that happen. So accept the grace you're being given and try to do better going forward. Brandon looked at her. Why are you helping me? After everything? Diana was quiet for a moment. Because 12 years ago, you pulled me out of a burning vehicle when you could have saved yourself. You went back for my soldiers when any sane person would have run. You saved my life, Brandon. Maybe it's time someone returned the favor. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You've still got a long road ahead. Rebuilding your relationship with Ben. Figuring out what your life looks like now. Finding peace with what you've done and who you are. I know. But you don't have to walk it alone. Diana smiled. I'm here. And something tells me those two Raptor pilots who escorted you down are going to want to stay in touch. You've got people in your corner, Brandon. Don't forget that. Brandon nodded, feeling something loosen in his chest. For 10 years, he'd been alone, carrying everything by himself. Maybe it was time to let someone help. 3 weeks later, Brandon found himself sitting across from Katie Chen, a journalist from 60 Minutes, who'd been chasing this story since the day it broke. So, she said, her camera crew positioned around them, let's start at the beginning. Where have you been for the last 10 years? Brandon had spent days preparing for this interview with Diana's help. They'd agreed he would tell the truth, most of it, anyway. The parts that mattered. The parts that might help someone else who was struggling. I was running, Brandon said simply. From trauma, from duty, from the person I'd become. I thought disappearing was the answer. I was wrong. You had a son. How did you justify leaving him? I didn't. There's no justification. I made a terrible choice, and he paid the price for it. All I can do now is try to be the father he deserves. Some people are calling you a hero for saving Flight 227. Others are calling you a deserter. How do you see yourself? Brandon thought about that. I'm a man who made mistakes. Who hurt people he loved. But I'm also someone who, when called upon, did what he was trained to do. I saved those people because it was the right thing to do. Not to make up for the past, nothing can do that. But because they deserve to live. You use techniques that most pilots say are impossible. How did you learn to fly like that? Years of training. Years of flying in situations where impossible was the only option. The Air Force taught me to never give up, to always fight for the aircraft. That training saved those people. Do you have any regrets? Too many to count. But if I could go back, the thing I'd change most is not leaving. I'd face my demons instead of running from them. Because running just meant I took those demons with me, and I hurt everyone else along the way. Katie leaned forward. What do you want people to take away from your story? Brandon met her eyes. That it's never too late to stop running. That even when you've made terrible mistakes, you can still do good in the world. And that sometimes the hardest thing isn't flying a broken plane, it's facing the person you've become and choosing to be better. The interview aired 2 weeks later. The response was mixed, some people saw a hero, others a deserter. But the story resonated. Veterans dealing with PTSD reached out to Brandon, thanking him for speaking honestly about his struggles. Pilots studied his techniques. And slowly, carefully, Brandon began to build something resembling a life. Saturday afternoon, 3 o'clock. Brandon sat in the bleachers at Van Nuys High School, watching his son step up to bat. He'd been coming to Ben's games for 2 months now. At first, Ben had barely acknowledged him. But slowly, gradually, something had shifted. A wave before the game. A nod after a good play. Small moments, but they added up. Sarah sat beside Brandon, along with Diana, who'd driven up from San Diego for the game. He's good, Diana observed as Ben took a practice swing. He is, Sarah agreed. He's worked hard. Brandon watched his son, his heart full of pride and regret in equal measure. Ben had grown into a good kid despite Brandon's absence. Maybe even because of it. Sarah had done an incredible job raising him. The pitcher wound up and threw. Ben swung and connected with a sharp crack. The ball sailed into the outfield. Ben dropped the bat and ran, his teammates cheering from the dugout. He made it to second base, and as he stood there, catching his breath, he looked up at the bleachers. His eyes found Brandon. And he smiled. It was a small smile. Uncertain. But it was there. Brandon smiled back, feeling tears sting his eyes. After the game, which Ben's team won 7-5, Brandon waited by the fence as the players celebrated. Ben jogged over, still in his uniform, his face flushed with exertion and joy. Good game, Brandon said. Thanks. Did you see that hit in the fourth? I did. That was solid contact. Ben looked down, scuffing his cleats in the dirt. Then, quietly, Coach said scouts might come to the regional championships next month. Yeah. It's kind of a big deal. Brandon's chest tightened. I'm proud of you, Ben. Ben looked up. Will you be there? At the championships? If you want me there, I'll be there. Ben nodded slowly. Okay. Yeah. I'd like that. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. A bridge being built, one plank at a time. Hey, Dad. Ben said, and Brandon's heart nearly stopped at hearing that word. Yeah. Thanks for coming today. Anytime, Brandon managed. Anytime. As they walked back to the parking lot together, Ben, Brandon, Sarah, and Diana, Brandon felt something he hadn't felt in 10 years. Hope. 6 months after the landing, Brandon stood at the Air Force Academy in Colorado, staring at the memorial wall where his name had been carved 10 years earlier. They'd removed it, just as promised. But the ghost of it remained, faint marks where the letters had been, a shadow of the man everyone thought had died. A ceremony was taking place behind him. The academy was dedicating a new training center, and Brandon had been invited as a guest speaker. He'd almost declined. Standing in front of hundreds of cadets, talking about his failures and his redemption, it felt too raw, too exposed. But Diana had convinced him. They need to hear your story, she'd said. Not the legend. The truth. Because some of them are going to struggle like you did. And they need to know there's a way back. So he'd come. Now, as he stood before the microphone, looking out at the sea of young faces, Brandon took a breath and began. 10 years ago, I stood where you're standing now. I was young, confident, certain that I could handle anything the world threw at me. I trained hard. I flew harder. I became one of the best pilots in the Air Force. He paused. And then I broke. The cadets shifted, listening intently. They don't tell you about that part in training. They teach you how to fly, how to fight, how to survive. But they don't teach you how to handle the weight of all those missions, all those decisions, all those lives you carry with you. I broke, and instead of asking for help, I ran. I let everyone believe I was dead because it was easier than facing what I'd become. I abandoned my duty, my brothers and sisters in arms, and most importantly, my son. Some of the cadets looked uncomfortable. This wasn't the inspiring speech they'd expected. I'm telling you this not to discourage you, but to warn you. The missions ahead of you, whether in combat or in life, are going to test you in ways you can't imagine. And some of you are going to break. Maybe all of you will, at some point. When that happens, don't do what I did. Don't run. Ask for help. Talk to someone. Let people in. Because the strength you'll need isn't just in your body or your training. It's in being brave enough to admit when you're struggling. He looked out at the cadets, his voice growing stronger. 6 months ago, I was on a commercial flight when everything went wrong. The plane should have crashed. 132 people should have died. But my training kicked in. All those years of experience, all those techniques I learned here, they saved those people. So here's what I want you to understand, your training matters. What you learn here will stay with you forever. But it's not just about flying or fighting. It's about being someone who shows up when things are impossible. Someone who doesn't quit when every instinct says to bail out. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have regrets. But those mistakes don't define you. What defines you is what you do next. Whether you run from your failures or whether you face them and try to do better. Brandon glanced back at the memorial wall, at the shadow of his name. I ran for 10 years. But eventually, I stopped running and started facing the consequences of my choices. It wasn't easy. It's still not easy. But it's worth it. Because on the other side of that fear and shame, there's a chance to be the person you were meant to be. So when your time comes, when you're tested and broken and convinced you can't go on, remember that it's not too late. It's never too late to come back. It's never too late to be brave. The cadets rose as one, applauding. It wasn't the polite applause of a formal ceremony. It was genuine, moved, grateful. Brandon stepped away from the microphone, his hands shaking slightly. Diana met him at the side of the stage. That was perfect, she said. I don't know about perfect. It was real. And that's what they needed. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Brandon was approached by a young cadet, a woman, maybe 20 years old, with sharp eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Sir, she said. Thank you for your speech. You're welcome. I've been struggling. With the pressure, with everything. I thought about quitting. But hearing you talk about coming back from failure, about not running, it helped. Brandon placed a hand on her shoulder. What's your name? Williams, sir. Cadet Williams. Williams, listen to me. You're going to be fine. You're going to struggle, and you're going to doubt yourself, and there are going to be days when you want to quit. But you're here because you're strong enough to handle this. And when it gets hard, don't be afraid to ask for help. That's not weakness. That's courage. The cadet nodded, her eyes bright. Yes, sir. Thank you. As she walked away, Brandon felt something settle inside him. Maybe this was his purpose now, Not flying missions or fighting wars, but helping the next generation navigate the same struggles he'd faced. Maybe that was enough. 1 year after Flight 227, Brandon Cole stood on the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base, looking up at the cloudless blue sky. He'd been working with the FAA and Air Force Training Command, documenting his techniques, teaching what he could to a new generation of pilots. It was slow work, frustrating at times, trying to put instinct into words. But it was worthwhile. Ben stood beside him, now 15, taller and more confident. They'd spent the past year rebuilding their relationship one day at a time. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, times when the past cast shadows over the present. But they were trying. That was what mattered. "So this is where you landed the plane," Ben said, looking down the long runway. "Yeah. Right about here." "Were you scared?" Brandon considered the question. "Terrified. But I couldn't let that stop me. Too many people were depending on me." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Then, Coach says I might get recruited." "For baseball?" "Yeah. That's great. It means I might leave. Go to school somewhere else." Brandon felt a pang but pushed it aside. "That's okay. That's what you're supposed to do. Grow up. Find your own path. But I'll come back. 4 visits." "I know." They stood in comfortable silence, watching a pair of F-22s take off in the distance. "Do you miss it?" Ben asked. "Flying like that?" Brandon thought about it. Did he miss the adrenaline, the precision, the feeling of pushing himself and his aircraft to the absolute limit? "Sometimes," he admitted. "But mostly I'm good where I am now. Here. With you." Ben smiled. "That's pretty cheesy, Dad." "Yeah, well. I've earned the right to be cheesy." A figure approached from across the tarmac, Diana, in her Air Force uniform, just finished with a meeting in the base command center. "Boys," she said, nodding to them both. "General," Brandon replied with a grin. Over the past year, he and Diana had grown close again, not romantically, but as friends who understood each other in ways few others could. She'd been there for every step of his reintegration, his therapy sessions, his moments of doubt. "How'd the meeting go?" Brandon asked. "They approved your curriculum. Your techniques are going to be taught at every flight school in the Air Force." Brandon shook his head in disbelief. Wow. You've helped a lot of people, Brandon. This is just the beginning." "I don't know about that." "I do." Diana looked up at the sky, where the F-22s were now just silver specks against the blue. "You know what they're calling you now?" "I'm afraid to ask." "The ghost who came back." Apparently it's becoming a thing. Pilots who struggle with PTSD, who think about ending it all, they're finding hope in your story. You're saving lives even when you're not in a cockpit. Brandon felt his throat tighten. "I was just trying to survive. And in doing so, you showed others how to survive too." "That's not nothing, Brandon. That's everything." The three of them stood together on the tarmac, watching the sky. The same sky that had broken Brandon, that had tested him, that had ultimately given him a second chance. Ben spoke up suddenly. "Hey, Dad." "Yeah. I'm glad you didn't die." Brandon pulled his son into a hug. "Me too, kid. Me too." As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Brandon felt a peace he'd never thought possible. He'd made terrible mistakes. He'd hurt people. He'd run when he should have stayed. But he'd also come back. He'd faced his failures, accepted the consequences, and found a way forward. And in the end, that was all any of them could do. Make mistakes, learn from them, and keep trying to be better. The sky stretched above them, infinite and forgiving. And for the first time in 11 years, Brandon Cole felt like he was finally home.